Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. Today, me and Eric and Alicia are going to be talking about mold testing. We know that this is a controversial topic because there are limitations to mold testing, but people also want answers about if there's mold in their house. So we're going to explore some of the pros and cons, when testing might help you, when testing might work against you. I I was personally benefited by identifying the fact that I had Stachybotrys in my house when I was a renter because I had my landlord try to tell me that it was just dirt, and the inspector that they brought in did just a visual inspection and told us that our mold that was microscopically identified as Stachybotrys was just dirt. So in that situation, that protected me. It helped me advocate for myself against my landlord. It helped me force some repairs. Now, ultimately, that house still wasn't safe for us. And Alicia, I know you had a really interesting experience with testing when your ERMI score didn't match your air test. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we have been in this apartment for, almost a year now. And I just got really sick after the remediation job they did in our kitchen. This is like a luxury complex, pretty brand new. We had a roof leak, and it just didn't, we did it ERMI because I just had an inkling that we were having a Stachybotrys issue. And in the ERMI, Stachy showed up and trichoderma, and very low spore counts, mind you. But when we did the air sampling, it showed none of that. It didn't correlate at all. So I felt so defeated. And, there is no safe levels of spore counts in homes. So how could I justify that home or that apartment was unsafe for me? I couldn't. So we had to spend the money and stay in the lease, even though I couldn't stay there anymore. So that's how it worked against me. And that's how I'm sure it's working against a lot of other people.
It verified for you that mold was actually present, and then when it came down to being able to use that as an action step, there was no action to really be taken. And there's also discrepancies between what you're going to find in dust and what you're going to find in air. The thing that Eric had told me quite a while ago now, when I was talking to him about mold testing, is like there's no mold testing that works. There's no good mold tests. And I'm like, how can there not be any good mold tests? Like, I really struggled with understanding where he was coming from and just even like fitting on that perspective, because I'm like, no, we need mold testing. We need to know what's in our houses. And he was like, well, what about if it actually hurts somebody? Because nothing is found in the air and there is something there. But he really takes it a step further, that there's no test that even exists that can pick up what we hypersensitives are even reacting to. Eric, I know you have tons to say on this topic. Why don't you let us know your thoughts with mold testing?
Well, back in 1985, before Stachybotrys or toxic mold was even discovered, there was obviously no testing at all. If you even complained about mold, it was an allergy and that was it. So all of the complaints about people saying there was something more going on, a toxic poisonous sensation, were immediately dismissed. And thanks to my military training and trying to work this problem the best I could with the conceptual framework that I have, I realized that this was getting on my clothes. It was getting in my hair. It was going home with me and still affecting me. And none of these doctors could pick it up. And even though my house might be perfectly fine, what I was carrying home on me after being in a sick building was more than enough to keep me sick. None of their tests were detecting it. They didn't even believe in it. You could tell them straight out, here's a black toxic mold, and they would fight with you. So when they started developing tests, it was air sampling. They would try to catch some of the stuff out of the air, look at it under a microscope, and say, well, we think we speciate certain types of mold. Well, even if they did, it didn't mean anything because they didn't even know that toxic mold could affect people this way. So it was dismissed. So then the next thing they go, well, we'll grow it in a petri dish. You set out a nice little dish for a while and it'll grow mold, and that way we'll know what's in the air. Well, Stachybotrys has such a large, heavy, wet spore that it doesn't get airborne very often. And it doesn't like the media in the dish anyway, and it needs more water than typically is in a dish. So it was all false negatives. They almost never picked up Stachybotrys because a viable spore just wasn't getting there. And most of the exposure was on the dead, dried up spores and fragments, the part of it that was getting airborne. So at each stage of the game, testing failed. And people would pay for this test and they'd go, well, we didn't find anything, so therefore I have no right to be ill. It must be all in my head. And it really worked against people. And even though the test, every improvement on the test where they could detect a little bit more, they'd go, well, this is progress. Well, it's still not even close to being able to correlate to what we hypersensitive people can feel. And until it does, it's working against everybody whose illness is driven by contamination or whatever a test doesn't detect.
Eric, can you think of any situation where a test might be helpful for people?
The only time it really worked is if the building was so overwhelmingly bad that it made everybody sick. And in that case, a majority of people, in that case, they'd go, well, we don't know how much toxic value is here, and we can't prove it anyway because there's no standards for what amounts of Stachybotrys or toxic mold of any kind can make people sick. But we do detect elevated levels and everybody's sick, so we're going to believe it. And that's the kind of court case that people could win, because when everybody gets sick, a jury's going to believe it. But if you ask a scientist, they'll still tell you, well, we did find Stachybotrys, we did find certain toxic molds, but not at the amount that would be capable of making anybody sick. There's just not enough there. So we still don't know what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Imagine in my case, imagine that I didn't know mold was making me sick and we were trying to discover that as fact or fiction. And the tests don't correlate, like thankfully my husband knows the game, right? He knows that, a few spores will make me really sick, whatever. But imagine if he didn't. And imagine the other people who get these tests and it shows nothing. And so they literally have no justification for their illness and their family doesn't believe them because the tests say there's nothing, there's very few spore counts, or the testers are coming in and saying it's impossible to have a house free of mold, and stuff like that. So it's just, it's a losing game. I feel like, kind of like what Eric said, if you don't have overwhelming evidence, it's kind of hard to show proof. But there are people who are sensitive like us three, where a few spores of Stacky in a room and we're incapacitated or we're feeling really bad. So,
and very few mold experts even admit to this. They'll still try to convince you that their tests are definitive. Not even close.
Well, Dr. Chin Yang, who we recently did a recording with that has not been aired yet, he basically said ERMI and PCR testing. Did he say air testing was trash too, Eric? I don't remember.
I think he was just talking about the ERMI, but air sampling was always trash because it never picked up the type of mold that you really needed most to detect, the large and heavy Stachybotrys.
Erica says it's very hard to show proof even to family. That's exactly what we're saying is the difficulty in this situation. On one hand, people need verification because they want to understand if this is really causing their illness. And then when the test can't find that to prove to them that this is why they're sick, even in a water damaged building or a building that's harboring hidden mold, it actually hurts the family worse. It leaves you more confused. It leaves you just not even sure what your next move is. I do wish that it was common knowledge that well, Eric, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, because I had another thought interrupt this thought as it came in. But I was thinking, I wish it were common knowledge with mold illness that if you're living in a water damaged building or a house that has water ingress, that you would just you would just assume if you have health issues that your environment was a part of it. But I also know that you firmly hold the position, 300 or 400 years ago, mold wasn't behaving in this way. So I can see how historically that might not be of just like common knowledge. But I mean, so I guess I'm asking you both, what's our workaround? How are families supposed to, how are they expected to navigate understanding if mold is what's keeping them and their other family members sick, if they can't find significant amounts in testing, if maybe some members in the family aren't as sick because they're not as exposed, what's the recommendation here then in actually helping people understand this?
Well, if you try to explain this from the point of view of classical toxicology, you're going to fail because people say there's simply not enough toxic value to make you sick. So when you approach the argument from that perspective, you're coming at it from a losing game. You're not going to be able to convince them. So, as I described in Mold Warriors, you have to express this as similar to a peanut reactivity, where most people they can eat a mountain of peanuts and the most they'll ever get is a stomach ache. But for some people, a few molecules of peanut will kill them. They go into absolute shock from just the smallest amount. And for some reason, in mold illness, we seem to be hypersensitized in a very similar way, but it's not peanuts. It's just some emission, toxic emission from mold, and it drives our immune system so wild that we can't really compare ourselves to a standard average person. And you've got to move toxicology off to one side and say this is an immunologic overreaction that somehow got programmed for reasons unknown. And doctors are still at a point where they don't grasp this. And think of how many people with peanut reactivity had to die before doctors finally said, wow, they really are collapsing from a few molecules.
That's a really good point. Alicia, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the funds and you have conviction to find the source, I mean, I would hire a really good mold tester. Is there a lot of good mold testers out there? No. I mean, there's options like Great Plains doing urine testing, my Lab testing. But again, those are not going to show you the full profile. I mean, if you really need proof, and you need someone to convince a family member, you can call us, schedule an appointment and we can do a family sit down consultation to let them know, hey, this is what's going on. And we could provide that validation if needed. So, for me, initially when I was going through the mold, I wasn't 100% sold on the mold factor because no one talks about this stuff. No one's saying mold can make you this sick. So it was just so hard for me to grasp that and really make that connection. And so the tests, thankfully, at that time, they did show some results for me. And so that was enough validation for me and my husband to get out of Dodge and get out of the home that was making us sick. But will that happen all the time for everyone's case? No. And so if you find yourself coming up at a dead end, again, you guys can reach out to us and we can provide that validation for you.
As Dr. Yang described, ERMI was developed as a research tool, not as a clinical diagnostic procedure. I mean, this is a work in progress. It's a development. It certainly doesn't cover all the illness. And as Dr. Yang explained, it's predicated on PCR testing, polymerase chain reaction, where they amplify the DNA up to a level where it can be measured. And it turns out there's many things in the environment that interfere with the ability of PCR to work. Things like gypsum or milk or biocide. Very common things. I mean, here you are trying to do your best to defeat the mold. So you're spraying certain antifungals, vinegar around, and this will interfere with the ability of the PCR test to function. So as John Banta outlined at the 2019 Mold Congress, he was making a huge mistake because he was assuming that the PCR was going to detect Stachybotrys if it was there, and he was shocked to find out that microscopically he would go into places where a PCR had failed and find identifiable spores of Stachybotrys. So this testing is absolutely not reliable.
Yeah, Jessica Oaks had just asked a question, is the ERMI the best way to test? And I think you just answered that, Eric. Two things that are standing out to me and just listening to this conversation is one, people seem to have an over reliance on testing to validate to themselves or somebody else an observation that they're making about their own health being connected to something. Are there any other ways that we can validate this observation without having a test that we can see may not provide an honest answer? What else can we do?
Well, that all depends on the mindset of the recipient. Most people are so blindly convinced in the invincibility of doctors' tests that they demand you've got to have a test, you've got to have proof on paper. And to somebody like that, we're in a phase right now where that's simply not going to happen. But if you can convince somebody that hypersensitivity does exist, then you can show them how the veins are standing out on your forehead, how you turn white in a moldy building, how your heart is pounding like crazy, how you get dark circles under the eyes, lips get pale. I mean, there are signs from mold exposure, and other people can observe them. Maybe if you drew these symptoms to people's attention and say, I'm going to show you, we're going to walk into a moldy building, and I want you to watch what happens to me, that might be
Yeah.
your best bet.
You're reminding me of when I was still in mold and I was doing my weekly Wellness Wednesdays. I'd watch my videos back some parts and I would literally have like a throbbing vein go down my
Yeah, when I was
forehead.
doing the mold tour, taking people to Stachybotrys buildings, that's exactly what I'd watch, the veins in their temple, because you could watch them start to pulse.
Jessica Page says, "Holy smokes, he just described me and my kids." The other thing that stands out in listening to this is, we have an over reliance on testing that hinders our ability to make observations that benefit our health. And also, the signs and symptoms of toxic mold exposure don't seem to be well understood because they're named 6 million different diagnostics or different illnesses. Do you guys have any comments on that about how the symptoms are always
Yeah, if
called
you look over
something
the
else?
history, it's fascinating because it's clear that this kind of phenomenon has had hundreds of false starts where people pointed at it, described it, and gave it a name. And after a while, when the psychiatrists or the mind body people jumped into action, that name became associated with anxiety, hysteria, an overreaction that was unwarranted because you can't prove it. And eventually that name falls into disrepute and people don't want to be associated with that name anymore because it's lost its credibility. So they invent a new one and start over again.
Yeah, you're talking about like the history progression of the names, but I mean even now like current misdiagnoses of the condition. Like people aren't really explaining that MCAS is actually an advanced stage of mold illness. They're talking about it as it's something completely separate, like its own separate illness entity, like not related, or like IBS or fibromyalgia. I don't see people looking back and making connections of, well, it's actually kind of obvious if you follow the symptoms back of how this can manifest in the body. And when the mold exposure part isn't known, I just feel like people can literally have like 12 different diagnoses and think that they're all right, and then they just don't know that mold could literally cause all those things.
Chronic fatigue syndrome is a fantastic example of the process because Dr. Gary Holmes of the Center for Disease Control was baffled by groups of sick teachers in sick buildings and coined the chronic fatigue syndrome, the 1908 Holmes definition, as a research tool to study this situation. And no doctors ever did because they didn't have an easy, readily apparent answer sitting in front of them. They just started diagnosing people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Oh, you've got headaches, you've got fatigue. Well, we'll just call it chronic fatigue syndrome. So people walk around going, well, I have chronic fatigue syndrome and I have reactivated EBV, maybe some other viruses involved, but nobody knows what it is. And when we found Stachybotrys at ground zero for chronic fatigue syndrome, people had already been running around for so long with this idea that nothing is known that when we tried to tell them, they'd say, oh no, you don't know anything. Chronic fatigue syndrome is just reactivated EBV and there's nothing known about it. So now the people diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome have become the greatest opponents of clarifying what the syndrome was coined for, saying, well, that's just a misdiagnosis. And if they ever do get a diagnosis of mold illness, they say, well, chronic fatigue syndrome is something else. How does that work? If Stachybotrys is at ground zero in the room that baffled Dr. Gary Holmes, it has to be what CFS was coined for.
Yeah, I see that same thinking in mold advocates on the groups who are like health coaches or health professionals. They'll really fight to keep these names separate. And it's like, how well do you even understand this illness if you can't explain how they're connected? And so it really sounds like that goes back to like the problem perpetrated by the healthcare providers of not taking time to understanding what they're saying they're specializing in, which is one of your biggest pet peeves, Eric.
Well, I'm concerned with the basic failure of the scientific process. Everybody knows that when you get confused in any puzzle, be it math or anything that you're trying to solve, a murder, if you get confused, go back to where you got confused, start over, see where things went wrong. And it's just mind-boggling that if you examine any illness name, doesn't matter which one, fibromyalgia, MCS, TIL, SIRS, any one of them, are people attempting to go back to the beginning and find out how this name started? Nope, not a single time.
I find it really interesting, and please, people, don't get upset with me, but I feel like people are content with receiving a diagnosis and not understanding the root cause. I see a lot of people on social media basically creating personas out of their diagnoses. MCS warriors and all of this, and EDS warriors, and autism mama and all this stuff. And I don't know, for me, I always want to know what the root cause is that's making me sick. I'm not content with receiving a diagnosis and just taking drugs to manage it. I know I'm being a little controversial here. I know I may ruffle some feathers, and that's okay. But finding the root cause is really important. And what I find really interesting is when we try to attribute something to mold, people get really upset about that. And I don't understand why. Why can't mold be the reason why you have 20 million diagnoses and issues? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Eric?
Sure. It's because prior to the 1980s, mold was not known to behave this way. In fact, it was very well known that you didn't have to worry about it unless you were eating it. I mean, you would literally have to be eating moldy sheetrock to get sick. And we know that people working in flooded areas would clean up moldy sheetrock without face masks, just dressed in their jeans, no personal protective equipment at all, and didn't get sick. Sometime in the 1980s, that started to change. All of a sudden, workers were getting sick. And the remediation companies, prior to that time, they weren't called remediation companies. They were just construction workers. And they started dressing people up and issuing protective gear and even doing lymphocyte testing so that if their workers had a strange alteration in their white blood cells, we'd go, something's going wrong here. This job is making you sick. And this whole thing did not exist prior to that time. So how could all these people have been working with mold and fake not getting sick? To me, this says some new toxic value has emerged. And it turns out if you look at Stachybotrys, most of the time it is fairly harmless. It has to get the right substrate in order to produce its trichothecene powerful saprotoxins. And guess what provides that? Gypsum. The wallpaper on the gypsum, on the sheetrock, cellulose. When they started testing Stachybotrys to study its toxicity, they removed it from its environment and tried growing it in a petri dish. and they found that it wasn't toxic. But if you put it back on the paper, it would start producing toxins again. So it's a matter of being in the right environment to produce these toxins, and that's produced immense confusion. So it explains how Stachybotrys can be outside growing on straw, maybe not be all that harmful, but take it inside and grow it on cellulose, the paper, and it is really super bad.
Just to piggyback off what both of you are saying, Eric, you just highlighted that this really emerged as a more severe problem in the 80s, and that could be why the symptoms weren't well understood. And Alicia, you pointed out how some people incorporate their illness as part of their identity, trying to maybe turn lemons into lemonade, but maybe bordering too much on like incorporating it into who you are to the point where you're not digging deeper for that root cause. I think there's another aspect of people living with lower energy, living with tons of depression and anxiety, always kind of on the brink of like not feeling great, but so chronically sick for so many years that it became their normal. I would say that I was in that category where I more developed like a type of like self-loathing almost of like what's wrong with me that I don't have the energy to do these things. But even people in that category who are just wondering like what's wrong with me that I don't have the energy to be the mom I want to be, to function in life that I want to be, that goes back to what Eric's saying here too of if this was so well established when mold came to the forefront, then these things wouldn't be a secret. Pharmaceutical companies wouldn't be able to sell us on 87 different diagnoses with 87 different pills because this would be common knowledge that we would look for these things when these symptoms occur. So just a thought.
Yeah, when this whole thing first developed, I thought, well, there's so many people trying to solve this chronic fatigue syndrome, and they're reading about the sick teachers in the sick buildings. I mean, this is known the world over. Famous, famous, famous. So, with so many people reading about this, surely somebody goes, sick buildings? I mean, they go to work and they get sick? That sounds like toxic mold. And they would step up, they would say something. And I was using this to judge whether doctors knew it or not, because we assume that if a doctor knows something, if a researcher says he wants to solve a mystery, he will proceed to go ahead and do that. And their failure to do this suggested to me that they lacked the knowledge base that would enable them to even conceive of toxic mold. So that's what I thought. And I go for quite a few years, maybe about 10 years, thinking, well, they must not know about this at all, because otherwise they'd read about it and say so. But now I'm finding that's not the case. There are many, many new mold experts. There are mold specialists, mold doctors. They've got all the awareness that would enable them to read about the origin of the chronic fatigue syndrome and go, I know exactly what that is. I'll go to the CDC and NIH. I'll go to Stanford. I'll tell them it's toxic mold. I mean, read about it. Sick building? Come on. What else could it be? They are not doing this. None of them. No doctor has stepped up to go, I can solve that original mystery. Dr. Shoemaker looked like he was going to do it for a long time, but recently, the last 3 years, he backed out and seems to have lost interest in that project. But he's trained many, many doctors. There's hundreds of people in his Shoemaker group. Thousands have read his books, and there are people the world over who could still look at this book, well used, and they'd go, yeah, I think I can solve that mystery. And none have done so. So therefore, we can't rely on doctors to identify this because they're not stepping up. In fact, we have confirmation that they can be fully aware, they can be apprised of this, and they will not speak. So I can't use a doctor response as an indication of whether or not they really know and understand mold at all. But what I could do is look at the insurance companies, because if they know mold is a threat, they'll write an exclusion for it. And this didn't exist prior to the 1990s. And if an opportunist who wants to sell products, snake oil salesman, somebody with the magic bullet cure, if they think you've got an illness that they can profit by, they'll develop some kind of special, sauce to sell to you. And this did not exist prior to the 1990s. So all the opportunists who leaped into action and are currently leaping into action to sell all kinds of stuff, you can see the process. They saw a market and they're leaping to fill it. Where were these opportunists prior to the 1980s? There would be record, there would be businesses, there would be magic pills. We could look in telephone books, we could look in the literature, we could look in magazines and go, yes, cure your mold illness. I have the special sauce, I have the cure for you. And it wasn't there. So even though we can't rely on doctors to step up, we know by the lack of ambitious con artists, snake oil opportunists, that they must not have been aware of this need back then.
Yeah, I mean, the mold
Did you have
issue
something
is
you wanted to
such
say,
a,
Alicia?
oh yeah, the mold issue is just such a cash cow. I mean, so many people are making so much money off of this. It's disgusting. And the reason why we bring this up time and time again, I know we sound like broken records and we are always shaming doctors and, the snake oil salesmen. It's because we want to motivate you guys to do the same thing. Because when there's enough people shaming these people that are trying to take advantage of you, the less likely they will want to continue doing that, right? Doing it publicly, doing it behind closed doors, doing it to their face.
We'll
You know,
implement like Chinese communist policies and just shame and embarrass anyone who doesn't do what we want, but use it for good.
I mean, we interviewed a gal and she was just so polite with how the physician treated her and her family. And I'm just like, no, your family member has incurred permanent damage to their health. You need to let that doctor know who let your family member fall through the cracks that that is not acceptable and that's morally wrong. And you need to take some accountability for that. And again, we're going to keep saying this. We're going to keep doing it. And we hope that we motivate you guys. We don't motivate. I mean, we're not trying to here condone violence or anything. Don't go punch your doctor, but be sure to let them know that they're an asshole or they're a con artist. Don't be afraid to do that because that's how they're operating. And at the end of the day, if you've gone through mold like us three have, it is freaking horrible. And the people that are taking advantage of others need to know that they're in the wrong and they should not be doing it anymore because the way people are suffering, they should not have to suffer this way. And we shouldn't have to put up with people who are pretending to help us, but are really just draining us of our money.
Yeah, we just got a comment that mold is not the problem, that metals are the problem. Well, the thing is, people are pointing at mold. It's like, that's the stuff that's making me sick. So what's making the mold worse? If it's metals, so be it. If it's pesticides, flame retardants, plastic particles, great. But in order to find that, we still have to look at the mold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be willing to study it, right?
I think you're making an interesting point, Alicia, which is something that Eric always says too, I know. But you're essentially saying, the doctors who don't understand what they're claiming to specialize in are actually hurting patients because when they're not able to help, because let's face it, a doctor who doesn't understand contamination inside or out, or mold remediation failures inside or out, or mold testing failures inside or out, how on earth are they going to honestly and properly support a patient? They're not going to know where to look for where that patient fell through the cracks. And when the patient doesn't respond great to that protocol, they're going to say, well, you just have MCS and MCAS and lupus. And they're going to just be given other labels because it's not well understood. And patients shouldn't stand for that. But they first have to understand that these things can all be connected to an exposure. Wide Awake 2 says mold is the biggest immune suppressant besides radiation that we have. It's a gatekeeper to allow other pathogens to invade the body. Unfortunately, doctors blame the pathogens instead of the root issue. We see this all the time with Lyme disease. You know, Lyme disease and mold patients have so much overlap with their symptoms. And the one thing that I've noticed is a Lyme patient who doesn't understand what mold is doing to their condition will not get better no matter what they do.
But that is a great observation because in Army biological warfare training, I was taught that if you apply low-level immune suppressants to a population, that doctors have a mental reaction where they will blame whatever secondary infection crops up and ignore the fact that many people over a broad geographic area have a lowered level of immunity. And that is exactly what doctors are doing and continue to do. And even if you explain it to them, they do it anyway.
Right. Well, they don't have a test that shows them they're wrong, Eric. So what else can they do?
Well, if you see people all in the same building suddenly get reactivated EBV or have a problem with cytomegalovirus or a fungal infection they can't clear or a sinus infection like nobody's ever seen before, shouldn't you look at the building?
We know that. Any final comments from either of you before we wrap up?
I just think there's, we're still riding on a big disconnect between our health and our environment. You have to take that into consideration. And if you have exhausted all of your resources and trying to figure out what's wrong with you, take a look at your environment. Take a look at where you spend all of your time. Put two and two together and see if maybe that could be the contributing factor that is causing all these health issues that you're suffering from.
Any final words of wisdom from you, Eric?
No, I think that about does it for today. I've had my rant.
Okay, well, everyone, Eric has a birthday coming up on Friday, so make sure you wish him happy birthday. If you want to buy him a cup of coffee on our website, you can do that. I think Alicia sent him a nice present, so surprise! Happy birthday, Eric!
All right,
Eric
thanks.
likes fancy rum, so be sure to send over a bottle.
Send us
If it
rum
gets
and we'll
fuzzy mold,
forward
we'll
it
send
to
it to
him.
him.
We promise it will get to him. Bye, y'all.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for joining us, you guys. It's such a pleasure.